The rain drummed against the windows of the Blue Moon Jazz Club like fingers tapping an endless, melancholy rhythm. Grace Hartwell sat at her usual table in the corner, nursing her second glass of wine and watching the stage where Sebastian Thorne played piano with the kind of effortless mastery that came from decades of practice. 5 years. 5 years of Friday nights in this same seat, listening to the same hauntingly beautiful music and receiving the same gentle invitation that she had never once accepted. Sebastian's fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over stones, coaxing melodies from the old Steinway that seemed to speak directly to her soul. Tonight, he was playing something she didn't recognize, a piece that sounded both ancient and newly born, full of longing and loss and the faintest whisper of hope. Grace closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that came whenever she heard something truly beautiful. Once upon a time, she would have moved to music like this. Once upon a time, her body would have translated every note into movement, every melody into dance. But that was before the accident, before the surgery, before the doctors told her that her dancing days were over. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian's voice drifted across the dimly lit club as the last notes of his song faded into silence. "That concludes tonight's set. Thank you for listening." The scattered applause was warm but subdued, fitting for the intimate atmosphere of the Blue Moon. Grace watched as Sebastian stood from the piano bench, his tall, lean frame moving with the same fluid grace that characterized his playing. Even after 5 years of watching him, she was still struck by his otherworldly elegance, the way he seemed to glide rather than walk, the way his pale skin seemed to glow in the stage lights, the way his dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond those of an ordinary man. He was beautiful in an unsettling way, like a piece of classical art that was too perfect to be entirely human. And every Friday night, without fail, he would finish his set and make his way to her table to ask the same question. Tonight was no different. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying that slight accent she had never been able to place, something European but ancient, as if it belonged to a time when the world was younger. "You look lovely tonight." She looked up at him, taking in the formal way he held himself, the old-fashioned courtesy that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He was probably in his 30s, though there was something ageless about his features that made it hard to tell. Dark hair that looked like it had been touched by moonlight, pale skin that never seemed to tan despite the stage lights, and eyes the color of midnight that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "Thank you," she said, as she always did. "That was beautiful music tonight. I didn't recognize the piece you ended with." "Something I've been working on," Sebastian replied, and for just a moment something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or pleasure that she had noticed. "I don't often play my own compositions anymore." "You should. It was extraordinary." "You're very kind." Sebastian paused, and Grace felt her heart begin to race with familiar anxiety. She knew what was coming next. She had known for 5 years. "Grace," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the quiet conversations of the other patrons, "would you like to dance with me?" The question hung in the air between them, gentle and patient and completely without pressure. It was the same question he had asked every Friday night for 5 years, always with the same tone, always with the same respectful distance, always ready to accept her refusal with grace. Grace began, then stopped, the words catching in her throat like they always did. She wanted to say yes. God, how she wanted to say yes. But the thought of moving to music, of trying to dance again, of facing the reality of what she had lost, it was too much. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I can't." "Of course," Sebastian said immediately, his voice warm with understanding. "Perhaps another time." He said the same thing every week, And every week, Grace wondered why he kept asking, why he didn't give up, why he didn't find someone else to dance with, someone who wasn't broken and afraid and living in the shadow of what she used to be. But Sebastian simply smiled, that gentle, mysterious smile of his, and returned to the stage to pack up his music, leaving Grace alone with her wine and her regrets. The Blue Moon Jazz Club was a relic from another era, tucked away in a narrow alley in the arts district of the city. It had been there for decades, maybe longer, with its exposed brick walls, dim lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that made people speak in hushed tones and linger over their drinks. Grace had discovered it by accident 5 years ago, wandering the streets in the aftermath of her accident, looking for some place to hide from the world and her own shattered dreams. She had been Grace Hartwell then, principal dancer with the Metropolitan Ballet Company, at the peak of a career that had taken her from a small town in Ohio to stages around the world. She had danced Odette and Odile, Giselle and Juliet, had been featured on magazine covers and interviewed by dance critics who called her a once-in-a-generation talent. Then came the accident. A simple misstep during rehearsal, a fall that should have been nothing more than an embarrassing moment. But something went wrong. A torn ligament, damaged cartilage, complications during surgery. The doctors did their best, but when the healing was done, Grace's dancing career was over. Not just diminished, over. "You'll be able to walk normally," the surgeon had told her with the kind of clinical kindness that medical professionals perfected. "You might even be able to dance socially, but the kind of demands that professional ballet places on the body, I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell, that's no longer possible." Grace had nodded and thanked him and walked out of the hospital into a world that no longer made sense. Without dance, who was she? What was she? For 35 years, her entire identity had been built around movement and music and the transcendent joy of expressing emotion through her body. Without that, she was just empty. The Blue Moon had become her refuge during those dark months of recovery and adjustment. She would sit in the corner table, hidden in the shadows, and listen to Sebastian play piano while she tried to figure out how to live in a world without dance. Sebastian had been there from her very first night, though she hadn't paid much attention to him initially. She was too wrapped up in her own pain, too focused on the gaping hole where her purpose used to be. But gradually, his music had begun to penetrate the fog of her grief. There was something about the way he played, not just technically perfect, but emotionally honest, that spoke to her wounded soul. He played like someone who understood loss. It wasn't until her third or fourth visit that he had first approached her table. She had been crying, something she tried not to do in public but couldn't always control, and he had simply appeared beside her with a glass of water and a clean handkerchief. "Music can be overwhelming sometimes," he had said quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, only understanding. "I'm sorry," Grace had whispered, embarrassed to be seen in such a vulnerable state by a stranger. "I don't—" "There's nothing to apologize for. Tears are just another form of expression, like music or—" He had paused, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "Like dance." Grace had looked up at him sharply, wondering how he could possibly know about her background. But Sebastian had simply smiled that enigmatic smile and returned to the stage, leaving her with more questions than answers. The following Friday, he had asked her to dance for the first time. Now, 5 years later, Grace sat in the same corner table, listening to the same beautiful music and receiving the same gentle invitation that she could never bring herself to accept. The routine had become a strange sort of comfort, the one constant in a life that had been completely upended. She stayed until closing time, as she always did, watching Sebastian pack up his music and chat quietly with the bartender and the few remaining patrons. The Blue Moon attracted a loyal crowd of jazz enthusiasts and night owls, people who appreciated the intimate atmosphere and Sebastian's extraordinary talent. Same time next week, asked Marcus, the bartender, as Grace gathered her purse and coat. "Of course," she replied, as she always did. Marcus was one of the few people who knew about her past, though she had never told him directly. He was the kind of bartender who heard everything and forgot nothing, and somehow he had pieced together her story from overheard conversations and careful observation. "You know," he said casually as he wiped down glasses, "Sebastian's been playing here longer than anyone, longer than I've been working here, longer than the current owner has had the place. Some of the old-timers say he's been here since the club opened." "How long is that?" Grace asked, though she wasn't sure why she was curious. 50 years, give or take. Opened in 1973, according to the plaque by the door. Marcus glanced toward the stage where Sebastian was carefully placing sheet music in a worn leather satchel. "Course, that would make him pretty old, wouldn't it? But he doesn't look a day over 35. Grace followed his gaze, studying Sebastian's profile in the dim light. Marcus was right. There was something ageless about Sebastian, something that didn't quite add up if he had really been playing at the Blue Moon for 5 decades. "Maybe it's just good genes," she said, though even as she spoke, she felt like she was missing something important. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, but his tone suggested he had his own theories about Sebastian's apparent immunity to aging. As Grace made her way toward the exit, she passed close to the stage where Sebastian was finishing his packing. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes met across the dimly lit space. "Good night, Grace," he said softly. "I hope you have sweet dreams." "Good night, Sebastian. Thank you for the music." It was the same exchange they had every week, polite and distant, and somehow full of unspoken understanding. Grace pushed through the heavy door and stepped out into the rain-soaked alley, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. The walk home took her through the arts district, past galleries and theaters and dance studios that she carefully avoided looking at. She had learned, over the past 5 years, to navigate the city in a way that minimized painful reminders of her former life. But sometimes, like tonight, the memories found her anyway. As she passed the Metropolitan Theater, where she had performed countless times, Grace caught a glimpse of a poster advertising the current season. The principal dancers were younger now, a new generation of artists who had taken her place in the company. She recognized some of the names, dancers who had been in the core when she was a principal, who had worked their way up to starring roles. Life had moved on without her. The thought should have been devastating, but after 5 years, Grace had made a kind of peace with it. She had found other ways to fill her days. She taught movement classes for seniors at a community center, worked part-time at a bookstore, volunteered at a local animal shelter. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life. Still, Friday nights at the Blue Moon remained her one indulgence, her one connection to the world of music and artistry that had once defined her. And Sebastian's weekly invitation remained the one reminder that somewhere, someone still saw her as a dancer, even if she could no longer see herself that way. Her apartment was small and comfortable, filled with books and plants and carefully chosen pieces of art that had nothing to do with dance. She had packed away most of her ballet memorabilia years ago, the photos, the programs, the reviews, unable to bear the constant reminders of what she had lost. But tonight, as she prepared for bed, Grace found herself thinking about Sebastian's music, about the new composition he had played. There had been something different about it, something that spoke of fresh inspiration after a long creative drought. She wondered what had changed for him. What had awakened his muse after what sounded like years of playing only other people's music? And she wondered, not for the first time, why he continued to ask her to dance when she had given him no reason to hope that her answer would ever change. As she drifted off to sleep, Grace could still hear the echo of Sebastian's piano, the haunting melody that had seemed to speak directly to her soul. In her dreams, she was dancing again, her body moving with the fluid grace she had once taken for granted, expressing emotions too deep for words through movement and music. But when she woke the next morning, the dream faded like mist, leaving her with only the familiar ache of loss and the knowledge that it was just another Saturday in a life without dance. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the city into a gray watercolor painting where the edges of everything blurred together. Grace sat at her usual table in the blue moon, but tonight felt different somehow. Heavier. The weight of 5 years of Friday nights seemed to press down on her like a physical thing. Sebastian was playing Chopin, a nocturne that spoke of longing and melancholy and the kind of beauty that could break your heart if you weren't careful. His fingers moved across the keys with their usual precision, but Grace thought she detected something different in his playing tonight, a rawness that hadn't been there before, as if some carefully constructed wall had begun to crack. She had been coming here for 5 years, and in all that time, Sebastian had remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, mysteriously knowledgeable about music from every era, and possessed of a talent that seemed almost supernatural in its depth and complexity. But he never spoke about himself, never revealed anything personal beyond his obvious love for music. Tonight, however, Grace found herself really watching him for the first time in months. There was something in his posture, something in the way he held his head, that spoke of a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. He played like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. When the last notes of the nocturne faded into silence, Sebastian sat motionless at the piano for a long moment, his hands resting on the keys as if he had forgotten where he was. The scattered applause seemed to startle him back to the present, and he looked up with that familiar, gentle smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying its usual warmth despite whatever private burden he was bearing, "thank you for your attention tonight. That concludes this evening's performance." Grace watched him stand and move away from the piano, noting the careful way he held himself, as if he were made of something fragile that might shatter if he moved too quickly. When he approached her table, she could see the exhaustion in his dark eyes, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that spoke of struggles that went far beyond the physical. "Grace," he said, settling into the chair across from her with a grace that seemed automatic rather than conscious, "you look thoughtful tonight." "So do you," she replied, studying his pale face in the dim light. "That was beautiful music, but sad, sadder than usual." Something flickered in Sebastian's expression, surprise, perhaps, that she had noticed the change in his playing. Chopin often is. He understood melancholy better than most. "Is that why you chose it? Because you're feeling melancholy?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the table's worn surface. "I suppose I am. Some nights the weight of things feels heavier than others." "What kind of things?" "Memories, regrets, the accumulation of years." Sebastian's voice was soft, almost distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying too much history, Grace? Like the past is a burden you can't put down?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, that Grace felt her breath catch. In 5 years of polite conversation, Sebastian had never asked her anything so direct, so revealing. "Yes," she said quietly, "every day." "I thought you might understand." Sebastian looked up at her then, and Grace saw something in his eyes that she had never noticed before. A pain that mirrored her own, a loss that went deeper than anything she had imagined. "Sebastian," she said carefully, "how long have you been playing piano?" "A very long time." "How long?" Sebastian was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I learned to play in 1847. I was 25 years old, and I thought I had all the time in the world to perfect my craft." He paused, his dark eyes distant with memory. "I was wrong about the time, but right about the perfection. I've had plenty of opportunity to practice." Grace felt her mind struggling to process what he had just said. 1847? That was over 170 years ago. It was impossible, of course. People didn't live that long. But as she looked at Sebastian's ageless face, at the depths of experience in his dark eyes, she found herself believing the impossible. "That's not possible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Sebastian's smile was sad and knowing. "You've been listening to me play for 5 years, Grace. Have you ever heard me make a mistake? Ever seen me struggle with a piece, no matter how complex? Ever noticed me aging, even slightly?" Now that he mentioned it, Grace realized that Sebastian did seem exactly the same as he had 5 years ago. Not just well-preserved for his age, but literally unchanged. His hair was the same shade of dark brown, his skin the same pale perfection, his movements the same fluid grace. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not entirely human. I'm what your folklore would call a vampire, though the reality is far more mundane than the stories suggest." Sebastian's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than revealing something that should have been impossible. "I don't hurt people, I don't drink blood from unwilling victims, and I certainly don't turn into a bat. But I am immortal, and I have been for a very long time." Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. A vampire? Sebastian was claiming to be a vampire. It should have been laughable. Should have sent her running from the club and straight to the nearest police station. But somehow, sitting in the dim light of the blue moon, listening to the rain drum against the windows, it made a strange kind of sense. "How?" she asked, surprised by her own calm acceptance. "I was dying of consumption in 1852. A woman found me in an alley in Prague, more dead than alive, and offered me a choice: die as I was, or live forever as something else. I was young and foolish and terrified of death, so I chose immortality." Sebastian's expression grew distant. "I had no idea what I was giving up." "What did you give up?" "My humanity, in some ways. My ability to create, certainly." Sebastian's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I was a composer before my transformation, Grace. Not a famous one, but passionate. I lived and breathed music, spent every waking moment creating new melodies, new harmonies, new ways to express the inexpressible." "And you lost that?" "Completely. The moment I became a vampire, my creative spark simply died. I could still play music, could interpret and perform the works of others with greater skill than I had ever possessed as a human, but I couldn't create anything new. For over 170 years, I haven't written a single original composition." Grace felt her heart clench with sympathy. To lose the thing you loved most, the thing that defined you, she understood that pain better than anyone. "The piece you played last week," she said suddenly, "you said it was something you were working on." "The first thing I've composed in 170 years, Sebastian confirmed. 3 weeks ago, I sat down at the piano after closing time, and for the first time in over a century, I felt inspired. The melody just came to me, as natural as breathing." "What changed?" Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You did. Me? 5 years of watching you, Grace. 5 years of seeing your pain and recognizing it as a mirror of my own. 5 years of witnessing your strength, your refusal to let loss destroy you completely." Sebastian's voice grew soft with emotion. "You've been my muse without knowing it. The inspiration that finally awakened something I thought was dead forever." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not inspiring. I'm broken." "You're surviving. You're here, every Friday night, listening to music even though it reminds you of what you've lost. You're living, even when living hurts." Sebastian reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Do you know how extraordinary that is? How much courage it takes?" "I don't feel courageous. I feel like a coward, like someone who's too afraid to try again, too afraid to risk failing." "And yet you keep coming here. You keep exposing yourself to beauty, to art, to the things that matter most to you. That's not cowardice, Grace. That's bravery of the highest order." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like a bridge finally completed after years of construction. "Is that why you keep asking me to dance?" Grace asked finally. "Because you see me as some kind of inspiration?" "I ask you to dance because I see you as a kindred spirit, someone who understands what it means to lose the thing that defines you, and who chooses to keep living anyway." Sebastian's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I ask because I hope that someday you'll remember that you're still a dancer, even if you can't dance the way you used to." "I can't dance anymore, Sebastian. Not really. My body won't do what it used to do." Bodies change, abilities change, but the soul of an artist, that doesn't die unless we let it. Sebastian's voice was passionate now, filled with the conviction of someone who had fought his own battles with creative death and resurrection. "You think I play piano the same way I did when I was human? My technique is different, my understanding is deeper, my emotional range is broader. I'm not the same musician I was 170 years ago. I'm better." "But you couldn't compose." "Because I was holding on to what I used to be, instead of embracing what I had become. Because I was so focused on what I had lost that I couldn't see what I had gained." Sebastian leaned forward, his dark eyes intense with urgency. "Don't make the same mistake I did, Grace. Don't waste decades mourning what was, instead of discovering what could be." Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. For 5 years, she had defined herself by her limitations, by what she could no longer do. But sitting here, listening to Sebastian's story, she began to wonder if she had been looking at her situation all wrong. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I. Every time I sit down to compose, I'm terrified that the inspiration will disappear, that I'll go back to being creatively dead." Sebastian's smile was gentle and understanding. "But fear is just another emotion to express through art. It doesn't have to be a prison." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to try something new. Not the ballet you used to dance, but something that honors who you are now, who you've become." Sebastian paused, his expression hopeful but patient. "I'm suggesting that maybe, after 5 years of asking, you might finally be ready to say yes." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. She saw the centuries of loneliness in his dark eyes, the weight of immortality that he carried with such grace. She saw the artist who had lost his gift and found it again through patience and hope and the willingness to try something new. And she saw herself reflected in his gaze. Not the broken former dancer she had become, but the artist she had always been, waiting to be rediscovered. "The club is closed," she said quietly. "I have keys. The owner doesn't mind if I stay late to practice." Sebastian's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the hope underneath. "We would have the place to ourselves." Grace felt her heart racing, felt the familiar panic rising in her chest at the thought of moving to music again. But underneath the fear was something else, a tiny spark of curiosity, of possibility, of the desire to feel alive again. "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be what you were. You just have to be willing to try." Sebastian's voice was gentle but insistent. "One dance, Grace. Just one. And if it's too much, if it hurts too badly, we'll stop immediately." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years of refusal, 5 years of fear, 5 years of defining herself by her limitations rather than her possibilities. When she opened them again, Sebastian was watching her with infinite patience, ready to accept whatever answer she gave. "Okay," she said, the word barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. "Yes, I'll dance with you." Sebastian's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face from something beautiful but remote into something warm and achingly human. "Thank you," he said simply. As the last patrons filed out of the Blue Moon and Marcus finished cleaning up behind the bar, Grace sat at her table and tried to calm her racing heart. She was about to dance for the first time in 5 years, about to confront the loss that had defined her adult life, about to risk discovering just how much of herself she had truly lost in that accident. But she was also about to dance with Sebastian, the mysterious pianist who had spent 5 years asking the same patient question, who had revealed himself to be a kindred spirit in ways she never could have imagined. "Ready?" Sebastian asked, extending his hand to her as the club fell silent around them. Grace looked at his outstretched hand, pale and elegant and steady as stone. Taking it would mean stepping back into a world she had abandoned, risking pain she wasn't sure she could handle, confronting fears she had spent 5 years avoiding. But it would also mean dancing again. "Yes," she said, and placed her hand in his. The Blue Moon Jazz Club felt different in the silence after closing time. Without the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses, the space seemed larger, more intimate, charged with possibility. The stage lights had been dimmed to a soft glow that cast long shadows across the empty dance floor, and the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. Sebastian led Grace to the center of the small dance floor, his hand warm and steady in hers despite his vampiric nature. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could feel the familiar panic rising in her chest as her body remembered what it felt like to prepare for movement. "We don't have to do anything complicated," Sebastian said softly. "Just move. Let the music guide you." "There's no music," Grace pointed out, her voice tight with nerves. "There's always music," Sebastian replied, releasing her hand and moving to the piano. "You just have to know how to listen for it." He settled onto the bench and placed his hands on the keys, but didn't immediately begin to play. Instead, he looked at her across the dimly lit space, his dark eyes patient and encouraging. "What would you like to hear?" he asked. Grace felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, though whether from hysteria or genuine amusement she couldn't tell. "I don't know. I haven't danced in 5 years, Sebastian. I don't even know if I remember how." "Your body remembers," Sebastian said with quiet confidence. 35 years of training doesn't just disappear. It changes, it adapts, but it doesn't vanish. My body is different now, weaker, limited. Then we'll work with what you have, not what you've lost. Sebastian's fingers found the keys, playing a few soft, experimental notes. "Close your eyes, Grace. Don't think about technique or form or what you used to be able to do. Just listen." Grace closed her eyes and tried to quiet the storm of anxiety in her mind. Sebastian began to play, not a recognizable piece, but something new, something that seemed to emerge from the piano like a conversation between old friends. The melody was simple but achingly beautiful, full of longing and hope, and the kind of gentle encouragement that didn't demand perfection. Despite herself, Grace felt her body begin to respond to the music, not with the precise, controlled movements of classical ballet, but with something more fundamental, the basic human impulse to move in response to rhythm and melody. She lifted her arms slowly, feeling the pull and stretch of muscles that had been dormant for too long. Her left leg, the one that had been damaged in the accident, protested slightly, but held her weight. She took a tentative step, then another, letting the music guide her movements rather than trying to impose any particular style or technique. "Beautiful," Sebastian murmured, his voice barely audible above the piano. "Don't stop." Grace opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression of such tender appreciation that she felt tears threaten. She wasn't dancing well. She could feel the limitations in her movement, the places where her body no longer responded the way it once had. But she was dancing. For the first time in 5 years, she was moving to music, expressing emotion through her body, feeling the transcendent joy that had once defined her existence. "I can't do a grand jeté," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she continued to move. "I can't do a perfect arabesque. I can't—" "You're not supposed to," Sebastian interrupted gently, his fingers never pausing in their dance across the keys. "You're not the dancer you were 5 years ago, Grace. You're the dancer you are now, and she's magnificent." Grace felt something break open in her chest, not the painful crack of loss, but the liberating release of acceptance. She had spent 5 years mourning the dancer she used to be, but Sebastian was right. That dancer was gone, had died in a hospital room with the news that her career was over. But maybe, just maybe, a new dancer had been waiting to be born. She let herself sink into the music, let her body find its own way of expressing the emotions that Sebastian's playing evoked. Her movements were different now, less precise but more honest, less technically perfect but more emotionally raw. She danced her grief and her fear and her slow, tentative hope. She danced the 5 years of Friday nights spent listening to beautiful music and longing for something she thought she could never have again. "Tell me about your music," she said as she moved, needing to hear his voice, needing the connection that words could provide. "Tell me about what you lost." Sebastian's playing shifted slightly, taking on a more complex harmony that spoke of centuries of experience and pain. "I was going to be famous," he said, his voice distant with memory. "I was young and arrogant and absolutely certain that my music would change the world. I had melodies in my head that no one had ever heard before, harmonies that could make people weep or laugh or fall in love." Grace spun slowly, carefully, feeling the way her damaged leg adjusted to support the movement. "What did your music sound like?" "Like this," Sebastian said, and the melody he was playing shifted into something that was clearly his own composition. Not the piece he had played the week before, but something new, something that seemed to emerge from their conversation. Like joy and sorrow and the space between heartbeats where anything is possible. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, her movements becoming more fluid as she lost herself in the music. "Why did you think you couldn't compose anymore?" "Because I was trying to write the same music I had written as a human. I was trying to recapture something that belonged to a different person, a different time." Sebastian's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I spent 170 years trying to be who I was instead of discovering who I had become." Grace understood that feeling all too well. She had spent 5 years trying to be the dancer she was instead of discovering who she might become. But here, moving to Sebastian's music in the empty jazz club, she was beginning to glimpse the possibility of a different kind of artistry. "What changed?" she asked, extending her arms in a movement that was part ballet, part modern dance, part pure expression. "You did," Sebastian said simply. "Watching you, week after week, carrying your pain with such dignity, seeing you refuse to give up even when giving up would have been easier, you reminded me that survival is its own form of art." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't stop moving. The tears were part of the dance now, part of the expression, part of the healing that was happening in real time. "I thought I was just hiding," she admitted. "Coming here every week, listening to music, pretending I was still connected to the artistic world, when really I was just existing. You were doing what artists have always done. You were observing, absorbing, letting beauty fill the empty spaces until you were ready to create again." Sebastian's music swelled, becoming more complex and emotionally rich. "You were preparing, even if you didn't know it." Grace let herself sink to the floor in a movement that would have been impossible in classical ballet, but felt perfectly natural now. She moved from sitting to lying to rolling, using the floor as a partner rather than something to leap away from. Her damaged leg protested slightly, but held, adapted, found new ways to contribute to the movement. "I'm not the same," she said, her voice filled with wonder rather than grief. "No," Sebastian agreed. "You're better. You're deeper. You're real in a way you never were before." "How can you say that? You never saw me dance before the accident." "I didn't need to. I can hear it in the way you listen to music, see it in the way you move through the world. You've been refined by loss, Grace, purified. The dancer you are now has something the dancer you were could never have: the knowledge of what it means to lose everything and choose to live anyway." Grace rose from the floor in a slow, spiraling movement that incorporated elements of ballet, modern dance, and something entirely her own. She felt like she was discovering her body for the first time, learning what it could do now rather than mourning what it could no longer do. "Play something else," she said, her voice stronger now, more confident. "Play something that tells your story." Sebastian's hands stilled on the keys for a moment, and when he began to play again, the music was darker, more complex, full of the weight of centuries and the loneliness of immortality. Grace felt the change in the music and let it transform her movement. Let her body express the isolation and longing that she heard in every note. "I've been alone for so long," Sebastian said, his voice barely audible above the music. "Not just physically, but creatively, spiritually. I thought I was condemned to an eternity of playing other people's music, never again creating anything of my own." Grace danced his loneliness, felt it in her own body, understood it in a way that went beyond words. She had been alone too, cut off from the thing that had given her life meaning, isolated in her loss. "But you're not alone now," she said, her movement becoming more expansive, more confident. "No," Sebastian agreed, and his music shifted again, becoming lighter, more hopeful. "Neither are you." They continued like this for what felt like hours, Sebastian playing compositions that seemed to emerge from the conversation itself, Grace dancing stories that her body told without conscious direction from her mind. It was unlike any dance she had ever performed, unlike any music she had ever heard. It was raw and honest and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. "I have an idea," Sebastian said suddenly, his hands pausing on the keys. "What? What if we did this regularly? Not just Friday nights, but what if we worked together? You dancing, me composing. What if we created something new together?" Grace felt her heart skip a beat. "You mean like a collaboration?" "I mean like a partnership. I've been playing solo for 170 years, Grace, and you've been dancing alone since you were a child. What if we tried something different?" The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. To work with someone else, to trust another artist with her vulnerability, to risk the possibility of creating something beautiful. It was everything she had thought she would never have again. "I don't know if I'm good enough anymore," she said honestly. "You're good enough for me," Sebastian replied, "and I'm good enough for you. Maybe that's all we need." Grace looked at him across the empty club, this mysterious vampire musician who had spent 5 years patiently asking her to dance, who had shared his deepest secrets and his most profound loss. She thought about the music he had just played, the compositions that had emerged from their conversation like flowers blooming in fast forward. She thought about the way her body had responded to his music, the way movement had felt natural and necessary and healing. "Okay," she said, the word coming out stronger than she had expected. "Yes, let's try." Sebastian's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Really?" "Really, but I have conditions." "Name them." "We take it slow. We don't try to be anything we're not. And if it doesn't work, if it's too much, we stop without guilt or regret." "Agreed," Sebastian said immediately. "Anything else?" Grace thought for a moment, then smiled. "Next Friday night, you don't ask me to dance. You just start playing, and I'll join you when I'm ready." "It's a deal," Sebastian said, rising from the piano bench and crossing to where she stood in the center of the dance floor. "Grace?" "Yes?" "Thank you for saying yes, for trusting me, for reminding me that it's possible to create something new from the ashes of what was lost. Thank you for asking, for 5 years of asking, for never giving up on the possibility that I might be ready to try again." As they stood together in the empty club, surrounded by the echoes of music and movement, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope for things to return to the way they were, but the quiet, steady hope for things to become something new and beautiful and entirely their own. She was still damaged, her body was still limited, her dancing would never be what it once was, but maybe, just maybe, it could be something better. 1 year later, the Blue Moon Jazz Club was packed for the first official performance of Nocturnes, the collaborative piece that Grace and Sebastian had been developing for the past 12 months. Word had spread through the artistic community about the mysterious partnership between the vampire pianist and the former ballet dancer, and tonight's audience included critics, fellow artists, and curious observers who had come to witness something entirely new. Grace stood in the small backstage area, her heart racing with familiar pre-performance nerves. But these were different from the anxiety she had felt a year ago. This was the good kind of nervousness, the kind that came from knowing you were about to share something beautiful with the world. "Ready?" Sebastian asked, appearing beside her with his usual quiet grace. He was dressed in his customary black, but tonight there was something different about him, a vitality and aliveness that hadn't been there during his decades of playing other people's music. "As ready as I'll ever be," Grace replied, smoothing down the flowing dress she had chosen for the performance. It was nothing like the tutus and leotards of her ballet days. This was something that moved with her, that accommodated her body's new limitations while celebrating its unique strengths. Over the past year, they had developed a completely new form of artistic expression, part concert, part dance performance, part storytelling. Sebastian would play his original compositions while Grace moved to the music. But it was more than just dance accompaniment. They had learned to communicate through their art, to create conversations between piano and movement that told stories neither could express alone. "5 minutes," called Marcus from the bar, where he was serving drinks to the expectant crowd. Grace peeked out at the audience and felt a flutter of anxiety. There were faces she recognized, former colleagues from the ballet world, music critics from the local papers, fellow artists who had come to see what the mysterious duo had created. "They're not here to judge," Sebastian said softly, reading her expression. "They're here to witness. There's a difference. What if we're not good enough? What if this whole thing is just self-indulgent nonsense? Then we'll know we tried something new and honest and brave. That's more than most people can say." Sebastian took her hand, his fingers cool and steady. "Grace, a year ago, you couldn't even say yes to a simple dance. Look at you now." Grace looked down at their joined hands, his pale and elegant, hers warm and strong from a year of rediscovering movement. He was right. A year ago, she had been a broken former dancer hiding in the corner of a jazz club. Now she was about to premiere an original work of art that she had co-created with a partner who understood her in ways she had never thought possible. "Places," Marcus called, and the lights in the main room dimmed. Sebastian squeezed her hand once, then released it and walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent as he settled at the piano, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space. "Tonight, my partner Grace and I would like to share with you a piece we call Nocturnes, a meditation on loss, discovery, and the courage to create something new from the ashes of what was. He began to play, and Grace felt the familiar thrill of recognition as the opening notes filled the air. This was the piece they had been working on for months, the composition that told both of their stories. His centuries of creative death and resurrection, her journey from broken dancer to something entirely new. Grace waited in the wings, feeling the music wash over her, feeling her body respond to the familiar rhythms and harmonies. When her cue came, a shift in the melody that spoke of emergence, of stepping into light, she walked onto the stage. The audience was silent, watching as she began to move. Her style was unlike anything they had seen before. Not classical ballet, not modern dance, but something that incorporated elements of both while remaining uniquely her own. She moved with the music rather than to it, her body becoming another instrument in Sebastian's composition. As she danced, Grace felt the familiar transcendence that had once defined her existence. But this was different from her ballet days. Deeper, more honest, more connected to her authentic self. She wasn't performing a role or interpreting someone else's choreography. She was expressing her own truth through movement, telling her own story through the language of her body. The piece unfolded like a conversation between old friends. Sebastian's piano speaking of loneliness and longing, Grace's movement responding with understanding and hope. They told the story of their meeting, their slow recognition of kindred spirits, their decision to create something new together. When the final notes faded into silence, the audience sat motionless for a long moment, as if reluctant to break the spell that had been woven. Then the applause began, not the polite appreciation of a typical jazz club audience, but the kind of sustained, emotional response that artists dream of receiving. Grace and Sebastian took their bows together, and Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not a return to what she had lost, but the discovery of something she had never known she could have. After the performance, as they mingled with the audience and accepting congratulations, Grace found herself in conversation with a young dancer who reminded her of herself at that age, all ambition and passion and certainty about the future. "How did you know?" the young woman asked. "How did you know you could do something like this?" "I didn't," Grace replied honestly. "I spent 5 years thinking my dancing days were over. It took someone else believing in me before I could believe in myself. But what if I get injured? What if I lose everything I've worked for?" Grace looked across the room at Sebastian, who was discussing the technical aspects of his compositions with a group of musicians. "Then you'll discover that everything is bigger than you thought. You'll learn that losing what you think defines you can be the beginning of discovering who you really are." Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the club had returned to its usual quiet intimacy, Grace and Sebastian sat at their old table, the corner spot where she had spent 5 years refusing his invitations to dance. "So," Sebastian said, raising his glass of wine in a toast, "what's next for the artistic partnership of Thorne and Hartwell?" "I don't know," Grace replied, clinking her glass against his, "but I'm excited to find out." "Any regrets? About saying yes? About taking the risk?" Grace considered the question seriously. A year ago, she had been safe in her grief, protected by her limitations, defined by her loss. Now she was vulnerable again, open to possibility and failure and the terrifying joy of creation. "None," she said firmly. "Well, maybe one." "What's that?" "I wish I had said yes sooner. I wish I hadn't wasted 5 years being afraid." Sebastian smiled, that gentle, understanding expression she had come to love. "You weren't wasting time, Grace. You were healing. You were preparing. You were becoming the person who could say yes when the moment was right." "Is that what you tell yourself about the 170 years you spent not composing?" "It's what I know to be true. Every experience, every loss, every moment of despair, it all led to this, to us, to the music we're making together." Sebastian reached across the table and took her hand. "I wouldn't change a single day of those 170 years if it meant losing what we have now." Grace felt her heart swell with love for this patient, mysterious man who had waited 5 years for her to be ready, who had shared his deepest secrets and his most profound gifts. So what happens now? Do we keep performing together? Do we take this show on the road? We do whatever feels right. We follow the music wherever it leads us. Sebastian's eyes sparkled with mischief. Though I should probably warn you, I'm immortal. If you're planning to be my artistic partner for the long term, you might want to consider the implications. Grace laughed, the sound bright and free in the quiet club. Are you offering me immortality, Sebastian Thorne? I'm offering you time, as much time as you want, in whatever form you want it. The choice is entirely yours. Grace looked around the Blue Moon Jazz Club, at the stage where they had just premiered their first collaboration, at the dance floor where she had taken her first tentative steps back into the world of movement and music. This place had become sacred to her, the site of her resurrection, the birthplace of her new artistic identity. "Ask me again in 50 years, she said, echoing the words she had spoken to herself so many times over the past year. Right now, I'm content to be exactly who I am, exactly where I am, for exactly as long as this human life allows. And if I asked you to dance right now," Sebastian said, standing and extending his hand with the same formal courtesy he had shown every Friday night for 5 years. Grace looked at his outstretched hand, no longer seeing an invitation to confront her fears, but an invitation to celebrate her triumphs. "I would say yes," she replied, taking his hand and rising to her feet. "I would always say yes." As they moved together on the empty dance floor, Grace realized that this was what healing looked like, not a return to what was, but a transformation into something new and beautiful and entirely their own. She had spent 5 years mourning the dancer she used to be, but tonight she was celebrating the artist she had become. The music played on, Sebastian's compositions filling the air with hope and possibility, and Grace danced, not the perfect, precise movements of her ballet days, but the honest, expressive movements of a woman who had learned that true artistry came not from technical perfection, but from the courage to be authentically, vulnerably, beautifully human. In the end, that was the greatest gift Sebastian had given her. Not just the invitation to dance again, but the patience to wait until she was ready to accept it. And in accepting, she had discovered that some of the most beautiful dances begin not with a grand jeté, but with a simple, whispered yes. What an absolutely soul-stirring journey of patience, healing, and artistic rebirth we just experienced. From that melancholy opening where Grace sat in her corner table, refusing Sebastian's nightly invitation for 5 long years, to that breathtaking moment when she finally whispered yes, to their gorgeous artistic collaboration that transformed both their lives, every single moment had me completely captivated. The way Sebastian waited with such patient devotion, asking the same question every Friday night for 5 years, understanding that healing can't be rushed, just melted my heart completely. And watching Grace realize that losing what defined her could be the beginning of discovering who she really was, pure perfection. That scene where she danced for the first time in 5 years, moving not with technical perfection, but with raw, honest emotion, was absolutely transcendent. I'm still getting emotional thinking about how they found healing in each other's brokenness. Sebastian's 170 years of creative death finally ending when he found inspiration in Grace's courage, and Grace discovering that she could be an artist in entirely new ways. The symbolism of 2 wounded souls creating something beautiful together was just chef's kiss perfect. Which moment hit you hardest? Was it when Sebastian revealed his vampire nature and centuries of creative loss? When Grace finally said yes and took those first tentative steps back into dance? Or that gorgeous finale where they premiered their collaborative masterpiece, proving that art can bloom from the ashes of what was lost? If this story of patient love, artistic healing, and the courage to begin again moved your soul, smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Your support helps me bring you more tales where love waits as long as it takes, and healing happens one brave step at a time. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think you could have been as patient as Sebastian, asking the same question for 5 years? And what did you think of the way they found new forms of artistry together, creating something that honored their losses while celebrating their growth? Plus, I'm dying to know which moment of Grace's journey from broken to reborn resonated most with you. Next week, I'm bringing you another heart-healing supernatural romance. She was the town's cursed seamstress until the Dragon Lord commissioned her to weave his heart back together. Get ready for magical craftsmanship, ancient curses, and a heroine who discovers that sometimes the most powerful magic is found in the gentle art of mending what's been broken. Until then, remember that the most beautiful dances often begin with the courage to say yes, and that healing happens not when we return to who we were, but when we embrace who we're becoming. The story of Grace and Sebastian reminds us that sometimes the most profound love stories aren't about passion at first sight, but about the patient devotion that waits years for the right moment. Sebastian's nightly question wasn't just an invitation to dance. It was a gentle reminder that Grace was still an artist, still worthy of beauty, still capable of creating magic even when she couldn't see it herself. And isn't that what true love does? It sees our potential when we've forgotten it exists. It waits for us to heal at our own pace. It offers the same invitation night after night, year after year, until we're finally ready to accept the gift of our own worthiness. Grace's journey from broken ballerina to collaborative artist shows us that our greatest losses can become the foundation for our most authentic creations. She didn't get her old life back. She got something better. She got a life that was truly hers, built on understanding rather than perfection, on emotional honesty rather than technical precision. The Blue Moon Jazz Club became more than just a venue. It was a sanctuary where two wounded souls found each other and discovered that their scars could become the source of their most beautiful art. Sebastian's 170 years of creative silence ended not because he returned to who he was, but because he found someone who helped him become who he was meant to be. Their story proves that healing isn't about erasing our wounds. It's about transforming them into wisdom, into art, into the very foundation of our most meaningful connections. Grace's damaged leg didn't disappear, but it learned to move in new ways. Sebastian's vampiric nature didn't change, but it found new purpose in patient love and artistic collaboration. So here's to all the Sebastians out there, the ones who ask the same gentle question night after night, who see our potential when we've forgotten it, who wait with infinite patience for us to be ready to dance again. And here's to all the Graces, the ones learning to say yes to new possibilities, discovering that our broken places can become our most beautiful, finding the courage to create something entirely new from the ashes of what was lost. Because sometimes the most magical transformations happen not in a single moment of dramatic change, but in the quiet accumulation of small acts of faith. A nightly invitation, a whispered yes, a willingness to move to music again even when the steps are different than before. The dance floor is waiting, the music is playing, and somewhere, someone is asking if you're ready to discover who you might become when you finally say yes. Will you take their hand?